Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Holmbjerg Bøtker. Chapter 17. Internal and External Validation. External validation was a cornerstone in Hegel's philosophy of rights. His presentation of external validation was framed as an argument to avoid totalitarianism in social organization. Hegel argued that if knowledge is based on a belief system, which lies outside of the human realm, anyone in the organization can overthrow the existing prevailing truth beliefs. Hegel argued that such a system should be science or religion. In essence, the system could be anything as long as the organization is of the belief that nothing that develops within the system can question the external system, which is used for validation. The system of validation is, to use the terms of Leibniz, a representation of the pre-established harmony, which enables any knowledge to exist within the organization by presenting a field of possible interactions. Schopenhauer also dealt with validation sources, but with more of a causal explanation. The method of transcending the phenomenal world was to seek validation in the only material object which we have access to from the inside, namely, our own body. As the body is an analog phenomenal representation of an undifferentiated noumenal reality, any knowledge of this would disclose the entire harmony of the noumenal world. Internal validation was therefore not only an insight into a single interaction, but insight into the field, which is the pre-established noumenal harmony. Seeking external validation in the phenomenal world, or perhaps even worse, for Schopenhauer, internal validation in social conceptual frameworks could only lead to illusion. Fields of validation. Internal and external validation relates to the characterization of the field in which the knowledge is validated. We use fields to give validation to the relations we impose on the interaction between objects. A field exists as the collection of interactions between several actualized objects. As the field exists as interactions between actualized objects, it is also related to, but not dependent on, the form in which an interaction can exist, i.e., as either expressive or perceptive. A collection of objects is a set, and a field can therefore be described as the interactions within a set. While there might be indirect relations in the form of social norms between the characterization of the field and the existence of the set as either finite or infinite, there is no dependence on or direct relations to the set. A collection of actualized objects is a set where objects are delineated by their shared boundaries, which represents the possibility of interactions between objects. Objects can only interact with other objects if the possibility of shared boundaries exists. The possibility of boundaries represents a harmonious relationship between objects. As a field is a collection of multiple interactions, a field exists as multiple harmonious relationships which exist as a whole. The existence of these multiple relationships represents a harmony. If a harmony represents all possibilities of interaction, it is characterized as an analog to the noumenal, undifferentiated pre-established harmony. The pre-established harmony represents possibilities of interactions and ensures the compatibility in the exchange of property between all potential objects in the actualization process. A set is possible only because the pre-established harmony allows it to be, and within that set, the collective of shared boundaries represents a field of interactions. The shared boundaries in a set as a field is therefore both subject to and a representation of the pre-established harmony. A field that is an analog representation of the pre-established harmony represents any possible interaction in a set. It represents any possible shared boundaries through which objects in a set can be delineated and positioned. A field can be described as the ability to represent property through the shared boundary as an interaction. Interactions can either be expressive or perceptive. A field can be composed of either expressive or perceptive interactions, but not both. If the field is composed of expressive interactions, it represents the possibility of exchanging property from the object that exists as the expressing object. The expressing object is the object that constitutes the foundation of an interaction. A field of expressive interactions is therefore a constitutive field. A constitutive field concerns the structures of a set through which the set emerges in a dimension. If the field is composed of perceptive interactions, it represents the possibility of exchanging property from the object that exists as the perceiving object. The perceiving object recognizes the expression of property from the expressing object. This recognition governs the representation of property in the actualization process. A field of perceptive interactions is therefore a governing field. A governing field concerns the structures of a set through which interactions in a set exists in a dimension. Spatial fields. A spatial field is a field which is composed of interactions in the spatial dimension. Spatial fields are based on the interactions that exist in the field and therefore subject to the existence of the interactions as expressive or perceptive. The analog phenomenal representation of the property in the spatial dimensions is the property, which is represented by the expressing object. A collection of expressive interactions composes a constitutive field, where the phenomenal representation of property is an analog to the infinite noumenal property of the potential objects. The infinite possibilities of interactions represents the pre-established harmony. A constitutive field, as a collection of expressive interactions in the spatial dimension, is therefore a representation of the pre-established harmony. A spatial constitutive field thereby represents any possible phenomenal expression in the spatial dimension as a representation of the pre-established harmony. A spatial constitutive field acts as a form of validation that exists within the spatial dimension and exists as a form of internal validation. Internal validation in the spatial dimension is a representation of the pre-established harmony, and as such represents all possible interactions within the spatial dimension. The phenomenal spatial dimension represents a finite number of possible interactions. The spatial field, as a phenomenal representation, can be disrupted by an occurrence which has not yet existed in the phenomenal world. Knowledge which is internally validated through a constitutive spatial field has the characteristic of disruptive possibilities. The disrupting possibilities is a result of the absorption within the dimension, where a constitutive field enables a heterogeneous absorption of new interactions into the field, and therefore new representations of objects. Interactions always exists as either expressive or perceptive, and a field can therefore also be a field of perceptive interactions. A collection of perceptive interactions enable the phenomenal representation through recognition. This recognition governs the actualized object as a representation existing in the perception of the perceiving object. A spatial governing field enables the perceiving objects in the spatial dimension to recognize the expressions of other objects. As such, a spatial governing field is an analog to a collection of perceptive interactions in the phenomenal world. It is a representation of a collection of interactions between the phenomenal expressions subjected to the ability of recognition by the perceiving objects in the set. A spatial governing field represents the abilities of recognition by the objects in a set. Knowledge based on a spatial governing field is therefore externally validated on the abilities of recognition which exists in the perceiving objects. Any creation of knowledge is normative, predicated upon the ability of recognition. This in turn causes any absorption of knowledge to be homogeneous to the already existing shared boundaries of the field. Temporal fields. Temporal fields exist as the interactions between objects in a temporal set. The field within the set is based on the interactions that exists in the field and therefore subject to the existence of the interactions as expressive or perceptive. Temporal expressive interactions constitute a temporal field. A temporal constitutive field enables any possible phenomenal expression which occur in the temporal dimension. The temporal field exists as phenomenal perceptions, and the expressions that exists within the temporal fields represents a harmony which is constituted by the perceiving object. This harmony is not an analog representation of the pre-established harmony. It is a harmony which is constituted by the perceiving objects, by projecting the spatial expressions through the ability of recognition by the perceiving objects. A temporal constitutive field is therefore subject to the capabilities of phenomenal recognition as a mediating harmony. A temporal constitutive field is an analog to the expression of phenomenal recognition in a set. Absorption in a temporal constitutive field is homogeneous to the shared boundaries, which is represented in the projection. As such, any developments from the temporal constitutive field is a normative development upon the projection, which facilitated the harmony. Temporal perceptive interactions govern a temporal field. A temporal governing field enables the objects in the temporal dimension to exist as perceived entities, representing the noumenal property of the perceiving object as phenomenally recognized by the perceiving object. The perceptions from a set of objects in the temporal dimension is a noumenal representation of the property of the perceiving objects. The objects in the temporal dimension exist as perceived entities, and while the phenomenal perception of the spatial dimension represents the foundation of the temporal dimension, the temporal dimension itself is a phenomenal representation of the perceptions as they exist in the noumenal property of the perceiving object. The temporal dimension as a field is therefore a perceptive field of noumenal property. A temporal governing field is an analog representation of the pre-established harmony, as a harmony that allows objects to perceive other objects. A temporal governing field represents the structures of the noumenal property of objects that recognizes expressions from other objects in a set. The temporal governing field allows absorption that is heterogeneous, and can therefore allow new interactions that disrupt the perceptive field.